The Barbarian Betrayal, Chapters 42 and 43, The Belly of the Machine. Like the massive shield protecting it, the entrance to the bunker complex wasn't difficult to locate. "I'm guessing the big hole is the way in," Whisper giggled, setting off a series of rolled eyes throughout the team. "Thank you, Captain Obvious," Musashi snorted, sparing a brief glance at the twins following along behind. So far so good, but then they had hit no resistance yet. "Why haven't we hit any resistance yet?" Greybird asked. "They want to sucker us in," Tango answered from her overwatch position. "They'll wait until we're deep underground and then cut off our lines of retreat," she predicted, as another face popped up on her HUD. "Tango, what is the situation?" Nasat asked her. "Found the entry point," she answered, "but I guarantee it's a setup." "Understood," he replied. "What do you propose?" The sniper sighed. "Boss, move your people back. Way back." The Saurotor blinked and then nodded. "We are falling back now. When you are ready, Tango." "Copy that," she told him, before hopping back on the team channel. "All right, you two, get the door knocker ready. Everyone, clear the area." Tychist and Chechla shared a quick grin as they got to work. Since she'd wanted the old-timers keeping an eye out for, well, anything, she'd passed the door knocker onto the twins. It was an easy enough task, and they'd rehearsed it enough times in Sims for Tango to be comfortable with them performing it. But still. It only took a couple of minutes to get set up before Tychist launched the small drone, maneuvering it through his data link. Chechla handled the cameras, constantly checking their feed from multiple angles as her brother flew it over the bunker entrance, bringing it to a hover over the gaping cavity. "It appears to be a straight drop for dozens of meters at least," his sister reported. "I am unable to see any further, even with infrared filters." "Good enough," Tango told them. "Start your countdown." "Copy," Tychist said. "Beginning countdown on my mark. 10, 9, 8. As her brother counted down to 0, Chechla readied the release mechanism. Not knowing what to expect, they'd rehearsed several different scenarios, including flying the drone in manually, but given the terrain, they'd opted for something a little simpler. As her twin reached the end of his countdown, she pressed the release, dropping 1/100th of a gram of antimatter straight down the pipe. The twins were already down and covering their heads when the bomb detonated. The very ground beneath them rumbled, transmitting a ripple in every direction as a massive fireball erupted at the crater's mouth, sending out a shockwave that blasted them with a wall of dirt and debris. The pair held on to each other for dear life as the roaring blast seemed to go on and on and on, raining down grit and dust as the entrance collapsed in on itself, leaving a massive caldera behind as the smoke slowly began to clear. The pair stared wide-eyed at the devastation. "Wow," Tychist managed, as his sister could only nod in agreement. The rest of the team emerged from their own covered positions, cautiously moving forward to inspect the damage. There must have been a large cavity just under the surface, much like a sinkhole, leaving an enormous depression behind as the ground filled the empty space. As Musashi peered over the edge, he spotted a series of tunnels, now uncovered. "I think we got their attention," Greybird said dryly, as Whisper got a glimpse and started giggling, while Tango got on the horn. "Boss, the way is open," she informed him. "Go ahead and bring everyone up. The only way this works is if we hit them hard and keep hitting them, to keep them off balance." "I agree," Nasat replied. "We're coming up now." "All right, people," Tango snapped. "Move in and take positions." The team headed down the pile of scree at the edge of the hole, picking their way down as they covered the tunnel entrances, with the Saurotor twins bringing up the rear. Minutes later, the rest of the bunker team arrived, predictably led by Nasat and Giage. They spotted Tango and made a beeline to confer with her, as the others moved in behind them and climbed down into the pit. "We can't stay here," Tango informed the pair. "We're sitting ducks." The two exchanged confused expressions as she rolled her eyes. "Freaking aliens, it means we're exposed." "An excellent point," the Diaksh agreed, as he waved forward the Konim contingent. Not wanting to be outdone, the Tetrarchy forces were up and moving a heartbeat after. "Keep moving," Nasat ordered. "We are right behind you." He spotted his children and gave them a brief nod as they trotted past him, forcing himself to stay focused. "You heard him, guys," she called out, glancing at the tunnel entrance with a sigh as she quickly and expertly broke down her sniper rifle and stowed it, coming up with a pair of auto pistols in its place. "It's run and gun time." Whisper whooped with glee, chambering a grenade in his launcher as he charged forward, firing into the tunnel's mouth with a muffled thwump. An explosion spewed out rocks and smoke as he ran ahead, with the others right on his heels. "Idiot," Tango muttered under her breath even as she was up and moving. "Follow the lunatic," she ordered, as the rest of the team disappeared into the darkness. Admiral Otsoa was being kept apprised of the situation on the planet's surface, but once General Nasat's team went through the energy barrier, they'd lost all communication. She hoped they'd be able to shut down whatever it was the machines were hiding down there, because if he couldn't, things were likely to become untenable. The enemy's hit-and-run tactics had continued non-stop, and every time they struck, they caused damage. Her people were dying. Maybe not the massive casualties they'd suffered when Phalange had collapsed, but in some ways, this was even worse. It was like the ancient form of torture she'd read about, where they strapped you down and dribbled water on your head. It didn't sound like torture, until you start thinking about what it must have been like. Unable to move, anticipating that next droplet, watching it fall. Drip, 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 drip. She shuddered and focused her attention on the monitors, trying to anticipate the next attack. If there was a pattern, they had yet to find it. The strikes seemed to come at random intervals, from multiple trajectories. There had to be a way to predict where they would strike next. A sudden surge in engine power, perhaps. Something. Adelaide pulled up the data from the previous raid and started examining the individual ships. Maybe there'd been a burst of communications. "Admiral!" one of her bridge officers shouted, yanking her out of her reverie, her eyes going wide as she stared at the plot. "Oh, shit!" she cursed, as the entire machine fleet suddenly accelerated, diving at her forces. Their energy beams began lashing out. "All ships, fire!" she shouted, as antimatter rounds and missiles exploded out from her position, seeking their prey as the enemy closed in. Otsoa didn't know what was going on down on the planet, but Nasat, or more likely Giage, had obviously done something to stir up the hornet's nest. She felt Buenos Aires shudder as they took a beam amidships, the klaxons blaring as medical and damage control teams responded. She put that firmly out of her mind. Dealing with those issues was the ship captain's responsibility. Hers was keeping the fleet alive. There was one bit of good news. Instead of concentrating their forces and coming in like one gigantic hammer blow, it seemed as if the machines had dropped whatever it was they were doing and charged at the Alliance fleet, which meant they were coming in scattered from all directions. If she could somehow use that? Adelaide studied the plot furiously for a moment and then got on the horn. "This is Otsoa to all ships. Make your course 032 by Mark 179. Keep together and keep firing! Best possible speed." The course she'd just sent them was where the machine were the thinnest. If they could punch through, force them to consolidate their forces and give them a real target, they just might have a chance. The enemy responded almost immediately, but they were at a disadvantage. As scattered as they were, it would take them time to gather their forces together, and time was on her side, not theirs. Even so, her ships were sluggish at first, slow to obey her sudden change in strategy. But as they poured on the speed, the most distant enemy ships were being left further and further behind. Those in front of them, however, it didn't take a genius to figure out what she was up to, which meant the enemy had two choices. They could either order those ships blocking her path to throw everything they had at her, or they could get the hell out of her way. Either choice would tell her something. It seemed to take longer than it probably did. The adrenaline surge always messed with one's time sense. But as she watched the machine vessels that stood between her and open space suddenly fired off their own engines and cleared a path for her fleet to pass through. Interesting. A thin smile crossed her features. So they were husbanding their resources, were they? She certainly knew the remedy to that. "This is Admiral Otsoa to the fleet. Once we have passed through the enemy's lines, prepare to come about. Her smile grew wider. They're close to the breaking point, and all we need is one more engagement to break them. The fleet took longer to reorganize this time, as they were reeling from the effects of Phalange's disintegration. Every time they shifted position or reacted to the enemy's tactics, there were stragglers, vessels confused where they were supposed to be located in the formation, or worse, those convinced they knew their role but were completely and totally incorrect. The phrase, herding cats, was an accurate description, and it was driving Admiral Hewholooksskyward bonkers. It was bad enough she'd inherited command without warning following the death of Admiral Matavosian. Worse, while they'd rehearsed and drilled Phalange religiously, they'd focused considerably less attention on what to do if it all fell apart. Like, almost none. She was scrambling to make it up on the fly, and it showed, but what else could she do? But as the last few sluggards rejoined the formation, while the squadron commanders sorted out the inevitable disputes about who was supposed to be where Adelaide was watching the machines. If they were planning to strike, it would be now, when they were still a ragged jumble. Nothing, not so much as a twitch. So I was right, she mused. They are conserving their strength. The question was why. If they were baiting a trap, moving against them now would be the worst move she could make. But given what she knew, she doubted that was the case. With General Nasat's forces on the ground, ready to breach their sanctum sanctorum, Otsoa was all but convinced this was the machines playing a conservative game until they resolved the situations on the ground and in space. Which meant the time to strike was now. She allowed the fleet a few more precious minutes to finish consolidating before she made the call. This is Admiral Otsoa to all hands. The machines are on the ropes. That's why they aren't attacking, and why we must. If they regain the initiative, we risk losing everything. Adelaide knew what she was asking of them, but in the cold reality of space, she had no choice. All ships attack! Making their way through the labyrinth of tunnels was a nerve-wracking experience for all involved. Their door knocker seemed to have driven the machines back for the moment, but everyone knew that wouldn't last long. Their suits at least provided them with illumination, and they were spared the usual claustrophobia associated with subterranean excursions, as the machines had bored out spaces more suited to subways than sewers. But that still left a limited line of sight, blind corners, and a deep sense of foreboding. Anything? Tango asked the rest of the team. Negative, Musashi answered after glancing up ahead. Unless our pet maniac has stumbled across something. Good point, Tango sighed. Whisper? There was a long stretch of silence, and then, I think you might want to get down here, the madman answered, and for once there wasn't a giggle or chortle to be heard. Shit, she cursed as she waved the others forward. Something in his tone had her instantly on edge. Tango followed the beacon in her HUD display until she came out in a larger chamber, where part of the wall had collapsed. Whisper had his axe in hand as he pointed to the opening. See for yourself, he said. Tango peered through the crack in the wall and felt the blood congeal in her veins. The machines had been busy in the months they'd spent on Xuj. In fact, from her vantage point, it looked like they had hollowed out half the damn planet. That was impossible, but the immense space below seemed to argue otherwise. There was room for a sizable portion of the fleet in that cavern, and Lord only knew if there were others located elsewhere. The rest of the team joined her as she watched in horror. Thousands, tens of thousands of the Ronin-like artificial forms were in motion, and as she blinked, one of the many bizarre structures seemed to disgorge yet another brigade-sized element of enemy warriors. Dear Creator, it is a factory, Chechla whispered. The others turned to her, wanting to disagree, but the evidence was impossible to ignore. Crafts of various sizes were in abundance as well, and though none of the team could imagine the processes at work, the proof was irrefutable. Things seemed to move in slow motion as Tango switched to the command frequency. General, you'd better get down here, she said in a husky voice. The Soratar was on the horn immediately. What have you found? He asked. She could only stare wide-eyed at the sea of movement as even more machines began to form up. Better hurry. Their chamber was filling up fast as the two commanders and their retinues joined the team already observing the activity far below. "We must attack now," Giage vowed. "Any delay now means unleashing that swarm against our people." "Attack where?" Nasat queried. "They outnumber us by a considerable amount. Unless we can find some vulnerable point, something that will allow us to truly cripple them." There," Tango pointed with sudden confidence at the largest structure. "That has to be the power plant," she said with certainty. "And if it's 0-point energy like we think, it'll make for one hell of a bang when we take it down." Greybird checked one of his instruments and nodded. "I'm getting EM readings off the scale from that station," he concurred. "That's gotta be it." Giage snatched up his rifle as he rose to his feet. "We finish this now!" he snarled, waving the other Konhim forward, and for once Nasat didn't argue. The Tetrarchy forces were right on their heels, even as the wrecking crew shouldered their way through the throng to take point once more. Threading their way through the unmarked tunnels was growing more difficult. Getting lost inside the maze was becoming a real possibility. It had forced them to backtrack several times as they found themselves at dead ends, or heading in the wrong direction, but as they emerged into yet another cavity, Tango called a halt to get their bearings. Greybird examined the display of the EM field emitter he carried, and then shook his head. "Something's off," he said in confusion. "These readings don't make any sense." "What do you mean they don't make sense?" Tango demanded. "I mean the signal I've been tracking just went haywire," he shot back. "It's like it's being bounced around or something." "Are they jamming us?" the Diaksh inquired. "Maybe," the hacker answered. "Give me a couple of minutes to track it down." They took up defensive positions as he tried to clear up the readings. The Sorator twins found a spot near where they'd entered to stand by, as those in charge struggled to put them back on track. "I do not care for these passageways," Tychist said quietly, repressing a shiver. "Nor I," his sister admitted. "It feels unnatural." The pair looked around at the cavern, as Chechla turned back to her brother. "Our race was never meant to be underground." Tychist didn't respond. "Is something wrong?" she asked. "Chechla," he said softly, "why are the walls moving?" She didn't get a chance to respond as all hell broke loose. Weapons fire erupted all around them as the enemy machines began dropping from the ceiling, not bothering with weapons of their own, instead relying solely on their metal appendages and physical strength to tear their adversaries apart. Screams from human, Konhim, and Sorator throats added to the madness as the pair immediately moved to cover each other's rear, their own weapons opening up as one of the metal creatures leapt at them. It went down in a hail of gunfire, leaving them open to the flank attack as they sprang the carefully laden ambush. Whisper's axe swung as if he were Paul Bunyan himself, while Giage blasted a machine apart with a carefully aimed burst from his heavy rifle. Half a dozen of the enemy tore a Konhim warrior to pieces, even as a handful of humans and Soratar jumped in to beat off the attack. Friendly fire was taking down as many casualties as the invaders, as Nasat began shouting to fall back. Only the machines had anticipated that, cutting off their line of retreat just as Tango had predicted. "Forward!" she screamed, her dual auto pistols reaping like scythes. "Keep moving! This cavern is a fucking death trap!" Those still able to move fought their way clear, seeking shelter in the various tunnels leading away from the chamber, splitting them into smaller groups, herding them even further away from safety.